Welcome, everyone. This is the second session of Exodus Marching to Sinai with Rabbi David Silber, part of our Fall Zman at Drisha. I want to welcome everyone. Thank you for coming, especially with the recent time zone changes across the world. Join Rabbi Silber as he continues his ongoing series covering the first two books of Tanakh. We will make a careful study of the story of Exodus as the narrative leads to the revelation at Sinai. Rabbi David Silber is the founder and dean of Drisha Institute for Jewish Education in New York and Israel. Rabbi Silber received smicha from REITs. He is a recipient of the Covenant Award and the author of several books, including most recently Malchut Adam, Iyun B'Sefer Shmuel. And I asked also that if you have a preferred Tanakh or translation of the Bible, you should keep that at hand. While I will be sharing on screen from Sefaria while Rabbi Silber is reading, you may have different preferences. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Rabbi Silber for the day.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's get right into our topic. We started last week with chapter 15, the Song of the Sea, Shirat Hayam. And just to recap some of what we saw last week, the song or the poem or song, the word shir can mean poem or song, or both, is a marker. In other words, the end of the Exodus from Egypt takes place in chapter 15. We marched out of Egypt in chapter 14. Prior to that were the plagues and the whole negotiation with Paro, etc. But here in the end of chapter 14, we have been redeemed. The Egyptians have been drowned in the sea. And chapter 15 is the response of Moshe and the people, joyous response. Essentially, the main character of chapter 15 is none other than God, who dominates the entire song. So it's a song about God bringing about redemption. It is, as I said, a marker. After the song, we start the next step, which is the march through the desert. Now, as we'll see, it's also, in a certain sense, a march out of Egypt, not physically out of Egypt, but rather spiritually out of Egypt, as we will see in our study. That was the departing point of last week's class. I just wanted to come back and maybe just to refine a bit what we saw last week in terms of this song. What we took note of in the song, and we're not the first to notice this, Kasuto noticed it. I think we added a few details, but fundamentally, one of the interesting features of this Shirat Hayam is that, whereas on one hand, it is about the escape from Egypt, about Pharaoh's horsemen and chariots being drowned in the sea. That is certainly the main topic, but the language of the Shirah recalls something else. And what it recalls is a battle not between God and Egypt, which is essentially the story of Mitzrayim. In fact, Moshe said to Paro, God said to Moshe, I'm going to defeat the Egyptians. I will also defeat the gods of the Egyptians. In our study of the Exodus narrative, we noticed how some of the gods of Egypt figure in the story. The most prominent one is Ra, the sun god, and the theme of light and darkness, which we encountered several times in our study. But beyond that, the Song of the Sea recalls a description of the beginning of time, which was prevalent in other Near Eastern cultures. And that is that in the beginning of time, there's a battle, a war between different forces. And these forces are essentially, the focus is always the deep waters. And these deep waters, or the gods of the deep waters, they have names such as Yam, such as Tahom or Tiamat, such as Tanin, such as Nahar, such as Rahav, and that these terms here, for example, in the Song of the Sea, in those cultures, there's a struggle in the beginning, and one god emerges victorious. And I just to repeat what I said last week very briefly, what Kasuto points out is that in the first chapter of the Torah, he argues, is opposing that particular description. Because in the first chapter of the Torah, one God creates everything through speech alone. There is no opposition, and there's no resistance at all, and there's no effort. It's all done effortlessly, just through speech. And one of the main points Kasuto makes to demonstrate this is that on the fifth day of creation, Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagdolim, God created the great sea serpents. And Kasuto asked the question, why did the Torah single out the sea serpents? In general, in chapter 1 of Breshit, the Torah speaks of groups of things, fish, birds, animals, plants. It doesn't single out particular things. So it says God created the creatures of the water, but it singles out, in addition to that, the great serpents, the Taninim Hagdolim. And Kasuto made 2 points, which are very important. One is that this is in contrast to the other creation narratives of the ancient Near East, where Tanin is one of the main combatants in these other descriptions of creation. And the Torah says, listen, in this description of creation, Tanin is just another created thing. There's no struggle, there's no fight, there's no effort, there's no nothing. God created the Taninim. That's point number 1. And then he made another point, which is that's true in Genesis chapter 1, but in other parts of the Bible, there are references to this other creation narrative. And he mentions many verses in the Psalms, some of which are probably familiar to many of us. He mentions verses in the book of Eov. And either there or elsewhere, he mentions the Song of the Sea. The Shirat Hayam is Shirat Hayam, and the word Yam appears 7 times, and the word Tahom or Tiamat also appears. In other words, there is this other narrative which appears in different places within the Bible. And I would say that in Shirat Hayam, it's most significant because it seems to be more than just a kind of poetic flourish. In other parts of the Bible, in the Psalms, there are references to this, some of which we are certainly familiar with some of these verses. I'm not going to get into that. But over here, given the fact that God said to Moshe, I am going to do war against the gods of the Egyptians, God says to Moshe, this is not just me and Paro, this is a battle of me against the gods of Egypt. So it makes sense in a certain way that the defeat of Mitzrayim recalls this other mythic battle between the great forces of the deep, including Yam and Tahom, and God. And in fact, my formulation has always been, it's not just that God defeats Yam and defeats Tahom. It's not about defeating them. It's about it's about using them to fight God's enemies. Because God defeats the Egyptians by using these other forces. I wanted to add a detail to what I mentioned last week in this respect, and that is that perhaps one of the functions or one of the outcomes of sort of recalling this other great battle in the beginning of time is that it takes the story of Mitzrayim and it elevates it to a completely different level. It's not just about God against the Egyptians. It's about, in a sense, it's a kind of cosmic battle. The Yetziat Mitzrayim becomes not just one event in history. It becomes a kind of cosmic event. And I'll give you 2 other examples of this. One, actually, from a chapter in the book of Shoftim, which is very much connected to our chapter. Of course, the chapter I'm speaking about is the 5th chapter of the book of Judges, familiar to all of us as the Song of Devorah, Shirat Devorah. And you recall in that song, which describes the defeat of Yavin, the king of Canaan, and Sisera, his general, by the Israelites, by Yael, who helps us, Barak, the great warriors of Israel. And in that song of Devorah, one of the verses is that HaKochavim b'mesilotam nilchamu im Sisera. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. In other words, it's not just the war of us against Canaan, but the stars in their courses. It's a cosmic event. And it's a cosmic event for Devorah for a very simple reason, which is why the song is there in the first place. Because it's not just a defeat of a particular king. It is actually the defeat of the kings of Canaan, which after all is the charge of Israel to possess Canaan. The story of Devorah is not just another war. It's the successful, it's the, one might say, the fulfillment of God's purpose in creation. God's purpose was to create, amongst other things, a special place. In the first story, it's the Garden of Eden, from which we're banished. And then one of the replacements, the kind of alternative Eden, the alternate Eden is the land of Canaan. That's one of the alternate Edens. So the securing of the land of Canaan is a fulfillment, one might say, of the very first verses of the Bible. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So that's what that song is referencing. The stars in their courses fought against Sisera. We recall, by the way, that in one of the great battles in the book of Yoshua, where he tells the sun to stop, the sun not to set. It's a similar idea. The conquest of Canaan for the Bible is not just a war against some enemy. It's the fulfillment of some of God's purpose. That's one example I wanted to give. So in other words, the recalling of this other creation narrative, this other creation idea, is a way to represent the exodus from Egypt in cosmic terms. And let me give you another example of where the Torah does not the same thing, but something very similar that we have encountered ourselves, at least those who were studied here with me from the beginning of the book of Exodus, chapter 1 of Exodus. There's a similar thing going on. And that is, if you think for a moment to the beginning of this book, the beginning of the Exodus story, chapter 15 is the end of this section. But it begins by telling us that a new Pharaoh emerged in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. That's how the book begins. Jacob goes down to Egypt with his family, and Joseph and the brothers all die, and there's a new Pharaoh that emerges. And this new Pharaoh turns to his people and says, "Hava nitzchak balo." Let us outsmart them. Let us outwit them. Hava nitzchak balo. And what he does later on, amongst other things, is that when Moshe goes to him in the 5th chapter and says, "Listen, the people are working very hard. Our God has called upon us to serve God. Let us go out in the desert for 3 days and serve God, bring sacrifices, etc." And Paro says that's not going to happen. And instead, he takes away the straw and he makes them forage around the land to produce the bricks that are necessary, the quota. And when they can't produce the quota, the taskmasters of Israel are actually beaten. And if you recall that one of the points that we made, and I can't get into all the details of it now, but the simple point is this, that the language of Hava Nitzchak Malo and the idea of people having to forage around, and the idea of how the responsibility is to build, to make buildings for Paro, that all of these reference one story of the Torah, one that we read pretty recently in the synagogue. In fact, we read it a couple of days yesterday.
Migdal Bavel.
And that is Migdal Bavel. It's the Tower of Babel. And that's very clear, actually. And now the question is, why actually does the Torah reference the Tower of Babel? What is the point of the reference is clear. the question always is, okay, it's clear. You found references, you found common language. But the core question is always, and therefore what? What does it signify? What is the point? And the point is, I may have mentioned it then, but I want to re-emphasize it now. That in the beginning of the story of the Tower of Babel and the great significance of the Tower of Babel, that the Tower of Babel, which appears not long after the banishment from Eden, is a kind of false Eden. It's the people gathering together and say, we're going to discover for ourselves the alternative to Eden. And it's a challenge to God. They even say, the chutzpah to say, we'll build a tower up to heaven, Migdal v'rosho b'shamayim, and make for ourselves a name. In other words, the point is that story, which is in chapter 11 of Breshit, and right after that, the next narrative is God says to Avram, you go to the land. That's the beginning of chapter 12. That's the next narrative. And after Avram's command is to go to the land, 10 verses later, we find him in the land of Egypt. He leaves the land, says his wife's his sister, and he goes to Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim and Babel in the book of Breshit are the two narratives that appear right before and right after the command to go to the land of Canaan. In other words, the difference between Babel and Mitzrayim is they're similar. In each case, someone thinks they can take whatever they want. They can do whatever they want to do. But the difference is that in the case of Migdal Babel, it's similar but different. It's a direct challenge to God. You said X, we're doing Y. We're going to make for ourselves a name. We're going to build the tower, Migdal v'rosho b'shamayim. In the case of Paro, it's also someone who plays God, who says, I can take whatever I want. That's the idea of Paro. I can take whatever I want. It's my land. Everybody belongs to me. I'm going to take what I want. So it's similar to Migdal Babel, but it strikes me as somewhat different because in one case, it's a direct challenge to God. That's the case of Babel. In the other case, it's someone who acts like God, someone who takes whatever they want, which is Paro. They can't serve God because they're serving me, right? It can't be Avdei Hashem because they're Avdei Paro. So the point is that the beginning of this story, what the Torah wants to emphasize in the beginning of the Exodus story is, it's not just about people who are being enslaved. It is about that, but it's much bigger than that. By framing it, by recalling Babel, it's making a different point. This is about God's place in the world. This is, as I say, a story which has cosmic implications. So also the very beginning of our story begins this way, chapter 1, and the end of chapter 15 is also. What frames the story is very simply, it's more than just a story of a people suffering and an exodus. It has cosmic implications. Yes, now I'll take any comments or questions, please.
Yeah. The two things, just the issue of shame, which obviously, like the Naselat of shame and the removal of shame or fake naming with the Babel story and Shmot is obviously there. And the other thing is like Kagan Hashem Karet Mitzrayim, that kind of what you're saying about the creation of a place or what God's goal is not Mitzrayim, which is kind of faking it as Canaan, right? And that.
Let me just pick up that point and embellish it for those. It's an excellent point. Let me just say the following: what Yonina is pointing out is that when Lot leaves Abraham, he looks up and he sees Sodom, which is very fertile, and the Torah describes Sodom as Kegan Hashem Kieretz Mitzrayim, which is a remarkable statement because Sodom being like Mitzrayim, that's one thing, but what do you mean Kegan Hashem? Kegan Hashem sounds like the Garden of Eden. How did the Garden of Eden get conflated with Mitzrayim and with Sodom? But I think the point of it is that once we're banished from the Garden of Eden, then in a sense it's very similar to Mitzrayim because the Garden of Eden is a place where your choices don't matter very much. There aren't that many choices. And the alternative to Eden is a place, the land of Canaan, where, as you know, the Torah says, there's not always rain. The rain will come if you behave. If you misbehave, there's no rain. So it's not Mitzrayim. The water is always there. Sodom, there's always water. Gan Hashem, everything's there. So what happens afterwards, after we're leaving, humanity leaves Eden, then we are searching for a completely different kind of place, and not for, we have to leave Mitzrayim behind. But Mitzrayim and Babel, I find that quite interesting. And I mentioned just because we have completed the first part 1 of the book of Exodus, which is chapter 15. And chapter 15, one might say the story of the Exodus begins by presenting Mitzrayim as not just Mitzrayim, it's Mitzrayim and Babel. And chapter 15 it's not just Mitzrayim, it's Mitzrayim and God's war or God's manipulation of Yam and of Tahom. So it's a story which has sort of cosmic implications. That was the first point I wanted to make. Now, before we get to the next point about the song, and then we'll move forward, is there anybody else with a comment or question?
Rabbi Silber, I'd like to highlight a question that came up in chat from Ari Blech. Quote, also, Rabbi Silber, your point connecting this battle at sea to the creation narrative can bring added resonance to the 2 reasons for Shabbat as Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit and Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim.
Well, that is right. I think that could be related to it. I mean, I hope that we will come to that later on in the study of the book of Exodus when we get to the 10 Commandments. It's a very important point that at least in Sefer Shmot, the emphasis is Shabbos as a remembrance to creation. When you get to Sefer Devarim, though, there you have the additional element of Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim. So let's hold off with that to discuss that maybe in the context of the 10 Commandments. Okay, what else? Anybody else with a comment or question?
You can ask in chat or unmute yourself. We do really want to hear what you have to say.
There is actually another point I don't want to get into right now. I'll just mention the point, which I think is an obvious point, but to just fully discuss it, maybe we'll leave it for now. And that is that the other story that that the Song of the Sea or the story of the Kriyat Yamsuf recalls, without question, is the story of Noah, the story of the flood. The idea of in the case of Noah, the wicked humanity being submerged under the waters, which are conjoined together, right? That's how it works. And then afterwards, the waters are separated out, which recalls the beginning of creation. So the world becomes sort of uncreated and recreated. In the case over here, it's the waters that part to let Israel through, and the waters that are conjoined to defeat Israel's enemies, and in this case, God's enemies as well. That connection is actually very interesting connection that we'll pick up later, because one of the things to think about in our study of the book of Exodus is to what extent the book of Exodus, one might say, is a kind of second Genesis. In other words, not creation of the world, but rather creation of this particular people. And we will see, I think it become clear when we get a little further in the book, that this theme of creation, I mean, that's how chapter 1 begins.
Yes.
And that's how the book ends. It ends with this building of the Mishkan, which is based on the two narratives of creation. So it's clear, but there are many other things as well. So we'll leave it for now. We'll come back to this point. I think it's a very important point. I did want to discuss something else, though.
Can I say one thing?
First? Yes, please speak up.
Ladies first.
Laszlo, you can speak. It's okay.
No, go ahead.
I was just thinking that when Havan Chakma comes up, it just seems to follow in order. You first have the words, that pasuk, I think it's pasuk Zayin, Vayishritzu, you have all the words from Breshit. And then you go into the story from Havan Chakma, it goes in order. And then you have the Teva. It just seems to me that it's mimicking the order from Breshit to highlight for us that it's another creation story, but this time it's of Am Yisrael. And then when what you just brought up with the water again, and water is so part of, birth, that it
it just carries through. And then Chaim Leibowitz writes this whole thing on, when it's the Mishkan, that the words used there to describe are so parallel to the words used in Breshit, that it just goes through the whole time. It rings
No,
again.
as I said, the creation themes are throughout the book. There's more to it as well. The Midrashim note the parallels to the two creation stories. I can add a few things there, but when you see it, I think it's fairly obvious. It's actually both creation stories, not just one. But the Mishkan actually relates to both creation narratives, which is very interesting. We'll hopefully get there. Again, we'll get there. But I said, let's leave this for now. There's no question that creation language appears from the very beginning, first chapter of the book, and throughout the book. Noah in particular will figure later on as well. We'll see all that. So now I wanted to make just two other points about the song, then we can move forward. One of the points I want to make is, let me start with this. I'll start with the end. After the song is over, say in verse number 19, and then we have verse number 20. Verse number 20 is this: Vatikach Miriam hanaviyah achot Aaron et hatof biyada vateitze lechol hanashim achareha b'tupim v'imcholot vatan lahem Miriam shiru Hashem ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rochvo ramba vayam. And that's really the last verse. After the very next verse, we begin the journey through the desert. That's verse number 22. So I did want to say a couple of words about Miriam Hanaviyah. Let me just begin. A lot of what I'm going to say now may be obvious to you, but I'll say it nonetheless. First of all, Miriam is described over here as Miriam Hanaviyah, Miriam the prophetess, Aaron's sister. First of all, the very mention of Miriam is very striking, because in general, the Torah does not, the Torah basically doesn't mention too many women. I mean, in the lists, actually, when you have lists of the families, etc., it's rare to have women mentioned altogether. And what's actually quite interesting is that in the list, one of the lists of the Torah, which is chapter 26 of the book of Bamidbar, that's the list of the second census. The book of Bamidbar has two censuses, one at the beginning, and then the second census is the children of those that left Egypt, who were going to possess the land. And there, in the counting the census of the Levium, so it mentions Amram, chapter 26 of Bamidbar, and it says Amram married Yocheved, mentions Yocheved, and then it says Vatelu Amram in chapter 26 of Bamidbar, for those who have it, just verse 59, V'shem Eshet Amram Yocheved bat Levi asher yoda otam Levi b'Mitzrayim Vatelu Amram et Aaron v'et Moshe v'et Miriam achotam. It actually mentions that there are three children. There's Aaron, and there's Moshe, and there's Miriam, which is rather, now it's a verse that you might say, there's nothing, I mean, if you read that verse, yes, oh, so-and-so, so-and-so, they have any kids? Oh, they have three kids, They have John, they have Scott, and they have Mary. You wouldn't think twice about it. When you read the Chumash, actually, it's very striking, because the Chumash almost never mentions any women. And in fact, in chapter 26, it mentions Benot Sulafcha, but that's for a reason, because chapter 26 is talking about who's going to possess the land. So Sulafcha, Benot Sulafcha figure in that narrative. But Miriam, there's no narrative over there with Miriam, but she's mentioned anyway. The only other woman that's mentioned, which is very striking, for whatever reason, and the Midrash pick up on this, is Serach bar Asher. Serach bar Asher is mentioned for no apparent reason. So this must be, we don't know what the reader of the Bible 2,000 years ago knew. How do we know? We don't know who the implied reader is in these stories. It's clear that the reader of these stories knows certain things that we don't know. Right? There's the shame. What Nama is mentioned in the genealogies of Cain. Who is she? We know nothing about Nama, but the reader of the Bible may have known very well 100 stories about Nama. We don't know about Serach bar Asher, but the reader probably did know. But I make the point that Miriam is actually singled out over there. Aaron, Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. So she's singled out, and not just singled out over there, but there's something very striking about Vatikach Miriam Hanaviyah, because she's called Miriam the prophetess, and this is the first time that we have in the Torah that someone has such a title. In fact, in the Torah, there's only the word Navi only appeared one time before. Where did we have one time before? We have Navi appearing once before Miriam. That's Abraham. That's in the story of chapter 20. It's the story of Avimelech. God says to Avimelech, who took Sarah, says, return the man's wife. He's a prophet. He will pray for you and you will live. Navihu v'yitpalel badcha v'chyeh. So there it's interesting that Avram is called the Navi. And specifically, because he's a Navi, he's going to pray for you. Just to digress for a minute about that appearance of the word Navi, and then we'll get to Miriam Hanaviyah in a second. I was wondering the following thing, just a thought. I thought about it a few hours ago. That actually God says to Avimelech, Avram is a Navi, he will pray for you. So one gets the sense that one of the roles of the prophet is to pray for the people. The greatest prophet is Moses, and he certainly prays for us on more than one occasion. What's interesting is that how do we know that Avram is going to pray for you? Where does Avram pray for somebody? So Avram does pray for somebody. He never prays for Lot. That's what's striking. He never prays for Lot. He prays for Sodom. And what's interesting about that, this is an interesting thought, actually. Make of it whatever you will. But in chapter 18, God says to Avram, listen, I can't hide from you what I plan to do, right? Because you're going to become a great nation. And I know, right, that you instruct your children to do tzedakah or mishpat. Therefore, I'm not going to hide from you what I plan to do. And God says to Avram about Sodom. And Avram turns to God and says, what? Maybe there are tzaddikim there, right? Tzedakah. And Hashofei kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. Would the judge of the world not do mishpat? It's what God had said to Avram. I know you're concerned about tzedakah and mishpat. And Avram turns around and says, I am concerned about tzedakah and mishpat. And I have to question what you're doing, just to kill them all, because maybe they're tzaddikim. And after all, that's not mishpat. But what struck me this morning, actually, is that actually, if you think about the great prophets of the Jewish tradition, say the great prophets, take, for example, Yeshayahu. So he's one of the great prophets, right? And what is Yeshayahu's focus, actually? If not tzedakah or mishpat, the very first chapter of Isaiah. Siyom b'mishpat tipadeh, v'shavel b'tzedakah. The prophets, if you talk about Yeshayahu Hanavi, but what does he say? He says it over and over again. God cares a lot less about your rituals. What God cares about is tzedakah or mishpat. And I wonder, actually, whether when God says to Abimelech, listen, give Sarah back to Abraham, he's a prophet, he will pray for you. And we immediately go back 2 chapters to Sodom. I wonder whether now in reading chapter 18, after God says he's a prophet, I wonder whether the idea of the prophet as specifically being concerned with tzedakah or mishpat isn't already implied in the Chumash in terms of Avram being a Navi. A Navi is going to pray for you, and a Navi cares deeply about doing the right thing. So therefore, if you do the right thing, if you return Sarah, he's going to respect that. He's going to pray for you because you're doing the right thing. You're doing tzedakah or mishpat. If you don't do it, then there's no hope for you. So I just wonder about that. But in any event, he's not called Avram Hanavi. The first person who's called Hanavi is Hanaviyah, which is Vatikach Miyam Hanaviyah. And now the question is, what does that actually mean over here? What is Pshuto Shel Mikra? Because when we think about a prophet, I think it's fair to say that many of us would say that we think about prophets, we think about a prophet predicting the future. Sort of warning us about, if you don't do X, some terrible thing is going to happen. If you don't do X, God is going to bring about punishment. If you have behaved properly, there's a reward. That's when you read the Nevi'im. I think that comes through pretty clearly in our prophetic writings. And the Midrashim do say this about Miriam. The Midrashim, it's not in the text, but the Midrashim make the claim that Miriam is a prophet in the sense that she sees that Moshe actually is going to be her little brother, Moses, is going to be the ultimate redeemer of Israel. She can somehow foretell this. And the Midrashim have her then going back to her father and telling the father to reconnect with her mother. They've separated after Pharaoh's decree, and she says you can't do that. And the Midrashim say, because she knows, she foresees that Moshe will be the great redeemer of Israel. So the Midrashim actually take this idea of Miriam Hanaviyah, and they explain it in light of what we know about a Navi in general, which is that the Navi is one who predicts the future. So I just wanted to, that's what the Midrashim are doing. I just wanted to make a different suggestion about Batikach Miriam Hanaviyah, Achot Aaron, in this particular verse, what it might mean. Because when you think about prophecy in the Bible, yes, it's true that the prophet is a teacher. The prophet is the one who tries to instruct the people to do the right thing, tzedakah or mishpat. The prophet predicts the future. But there actually is another kind of prophet that we encounter in our study of the Bible.
Isn't Aaron called a Navi?
No, Aaron is never called a Navi. Oh, yes, he is. That is true. That when God said that sounds like you will be his Elohim. That is actually interesting. We talked about that. There it's more about he's going to explain to the people what your mission is, what your ideas are. And that's an important point, that the Navi is one who will talk to the people and actually speak for God. The Navi has two roles. The Navi speaks for God to the people, and the Navi speaks to God for the people. So the Navi both brings down God's word to the people. That's Aaron Achicha Yed Neviyecha. God said to Moshe, "You'll be an Elohim, as it were, and your brother Aaron will speak for you," because he knows how to speak to the people. He knows how to take your words and to present them to the people in such a way that they'll understand them. You, Moshe, can't do that, but he's very good at that. He'll be able to. That's Aaron Achicha Yed Neviyecha. Be your Navi. Never says it'll be my Navi, but it'll be your Navi. But here it's Miriam Hanaviyah. Sounds like the prophet. I was thinking that we have another kind of prophecy in the Bible, and I just wanted to put it out there. And that is, you remember the story of King Saul. Well, he's not yet King Saul, but he's Saul. And Saul was actually sent by God to Shmuel, who's going to anoint him as the future king of Israel. And Saul meets Samuel, and the whole story there, he doesn't know who Samuel is. And Samuel meets him, and Samuel says to him, "You're going to be the king of Israel, and I'm going to give you signs. You're going to have certain signs." Now, the point of the signs is not clear. Are the signs to demonstrate, to prove to Saul that he's really going to become the king? Is that the purpose of the signs? Or is the signs, if one wishes to read more cynically, less about Saul than about Samuel? After all, in the Torah, in the book of Dvarim, when it talks about signs, the prophet giving signs is to demonstrate that the prophet is a true prophet. How do you know this guy's a prophet? He says he's a prophet. How do you know? He's going to give you signs. In any event, he gives Saul 3 signs. What is the third sign? Who remembers what is the third sign that Saul is given? This is in the Sefer Shmuel. What was it? Shmuel Aleph, was it chapter 9? Let me just, who remembers the signs? I'll tell you. If you don't remember the signs, I'll tell you. The
Could
third
you give me the
sign.
pasuk?
I have to find it. Let me see if I can find it quickly myself. I believe it's chapter 9. Let me just see that.
Chapter 9 of
Let me
Shmuel.
just see a
which-
second. It might be chapter 10. Hold on 1 second. Chapter 10. It's Shmuel Aleph, chapter 10. So first you're going to find people, and the missing donkeys were found, okay? Then you find people who are bringing sacrifices. And then, the most important sign, then it says in chapter 10, verse number, what verse is that? 5. Achar came tavo givatu Elohim asher sham nitzivei plishtim. V'hi kavoach Hashem ha'ir. Ufogata chevel nevi'im yordim me'habama. V'lifneihem. Nevel v'tof v'cholil v'chidar. V'hema mitnabim. You will enter the town. You will encounter a band of prophets coming down from the shrine, preceded by lyres, timbrels, flutes, and harps. And then they translate, and they will be speaking in ecstasy. It's the translation of JPS. Literally, they are prophesying. Behema mitnabim. So who are these prophets? Sounds like a band of musicians more than a band of prophets. Chevel nivayim yordim mehabama, nevel tof cholil v'kidar, behema mitnabim. I mentioned that verse because over here we have in verse number 20, Vatikach Miriam hanuviyah. In our verse, Achot Aaron et atov biyada, Vatetzena kol hanoshim achareha pitupim uvimcholot. Right? Says Miriam, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and the women went out after her in dance with timbrels. So you're talking about music. You're talking about drums, some kind of musical instruments, and the leader is Miriam Hanaviyah. So it sounds like to me in this plain reading that this verse in chapter 15 of Sefer Shemot sort of is a precedent for what we see later on with King Saul. You will meet a band of prophets, and they are prophesying. It's what they call mantic prophecy. It doesn't necessarily mean they're predicting the future. It sounds like maybe it's related to prayer, but it sounds like they are coming together. Maybe the translation of ecstasy is not a bad translation. So it's a kind of ecstatic, let me say, an ecstatic response to what they perceive as God's presence. The prophets that Saul will meet are coming down from the Bama, from the place of worship, and they have with themselves musical instruments. The idea of music that can actually have this effect on you, of moving you to a different place, that I think is what we have over here. And I just want to pick up on this idea. So I think the simple shot over here of Miriam Hanaviyah is exactly that kind of prophet, a prophecy that we find in the case in Sefer Shmuel, the bands of prophets who have the instruments and are prophesying. I did want to just make one small point about this verse, about maybe 2 points, but let's start with one, and then take comments or questions, and then we'll move on to the next. There's a lot more to say about the Song of the Sea, but I think we're just 2 more points, and we'll move on to the next verses. And that is, we have this phenomenon elsewhere in the Bible, that women in particular are coming out to affirm some kind of victory. And I can think of 2 other examples which are very similar to this, but different, where the women come out after a victory to affirm the victory, to make the point that it's significant. I mean, apart from Shirat Devorah,
David and
which of
Goliath.
course is exactly that in spades. Shirat Devorah is not just coming out to proclaim victory, but actually defining the victory as this
David
great
and Goliath,
cosmic event.
doesn't it?
Where else do we have this?
David and Goliath.
Yes, that's the first example, and a very good one. And there, after exactly David and Goliath. David and Goliath is also in chapter 17 of Shmuel Aleph, and there we're told in chapter 18, verse number 6. Shmuel Aleph, Perek Yud Chet, Pasuk Vav. Vayhi bevoam b'shuv David me'akot et ha'plishtim. V'teitzena hanashim mikol arei Yisrael. Loshir v'hamcholot. V'krav Shaul hamelech. B'tupim b'simcha uv'shalishim. Here the translation is, I don't know what some of these instruments are. When David returned from killing the Philistine, that's Goliath, the women of the towns of Israel came out singing and dancing to greet King Saul with timbrels, shouting, and sistrums. I don't know what sistrums are. The women sang as they danced. Batanena hanashim hamisachakot batomarna. Ikashol barafav v'David b'rivevotav. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Now that song caused David a lot of trouble because Saul says right away, "What? Me they give thousands and David 10,000s? Maybe he'll become the next king." And from that day on, Saul saw David as Saul's enemy. But here you have a story, here exactly the story. David has defeated Goliath, and the women from all the towns of Israel come out to sing with the instruments. So, in other words, in Shirat Hayam, the one they are singing to is actually God. They're singing to God, right? That's what Shirat Hayam is. That's what Miriam is doing with all the women. And over here, it's singing to after David has defeated the Philistine. By the way, just to digress for a minute, whom do the women greet? Do you see what it says in chapter 18? Verse number 6. After David had defeated the Philistine, the women from all the cities came out with the instruments. Right? To greet who?
Saul.
To greet Saul. Doesn't say to greet David. It says to greet Saul. That's actually a very important point. We're not studying the book of Shmuel, but every time you read a verse from Shmuel, at least I do, you got to say something. Here's the point. Why not to greet David? Why to greet Saul? What is the point of what is the point that the author is making over here, whoever this author may be, who knows? But what is the book of Shmuel saying over here? The people are not out to degrade Saul. They're not coming out to insult Saul. The opposite, actually. They're coming out to praise Saul. They're praising Saul. They're saying to Saul, what a great king you are. The guy that you sent out, they don't know how David got, they know Saul sends him out. What do they know from the story? We know the inside story. David went to Saul, whatever. At the end of the day, Saul sends him out. The point is, they went to Saul. You slay, David slays 10,000, you slay 1,000, but it's not to insult Saul. They don't want to insult Saul. It's the opposite. It's like you have a company, okay? And you have this company and you have this great salesman. And you made a fortune of money. You're the head of the company. And the people have a meeting and call you in and say, you are a great CEO. The guy that you hired, it's unbelievable. he makes 10 times more than anybody else could make. That's not an insult to you. That's actually a compliment. And by the way, as I'm talking, as often happens with the book of Shmuel, I'm recalling something else, which is the biography of Saul at the end of chapter 14, which is a positive biography. And there it says Saul was victorious. Everybody he fights, he defeats Amalek. The end of chapter 14. Then it says, and when Saul saw a good person, he would conscript him. Every good person he would take to put on his team, which is the greatest compliment to a leader. You find good people and you bring them on the team. So the women of Israel are not out, God forbid, to insult Saul. On the contrary, they're out to blame Saul. But Saul, who's become sort of a paranoid at this point, he hears it differently. There was no intention to say anything negative about Saul. It's all inside Saul's head. Now, we know that David's been anointed king. That we do know, and we don't know how much anybody knows. My point is the women are not out to insult Saul. On the contrary, that's one example. We have one other example where somebody comes after a war to a woman to rejoice in the great victory. Another story which has a negative side to it, obviously. And that is the sad story of Yiftach's daughter.
Yiftach's daughter.
Yiftach's daughter, that's in the book of Shoftim. We're all familiar with the story. She comes out to greet her father, who has been victorious, as women do. She comes out to greet him. I don't remember. Let's see if she brought instruments with her or not. I don't remember that part of it. Let's see what we have over here. This is of course, it's chapter 11. Yes. Vayavo Yiftach HaMitzpah Beito, chapter 11, verse number, was it 34? V'hinei bito yotzeit likrato. We can write it ourselves. Bitupi muvim chalot. V'raki yechida ein lo yimena beno bat. She comes to greet him. Bitupi muvim chalot. In the spirit of Miriam the prophetess, she comes to greet him with tupim and mechalot, the same as the other women. And the fact of the matter is, of course, he has taken this foolish vow, and that's the sad story. But the point is, in each of these cases, it's dafka the women who come out, who sort of recognize what's happened and affirm it with song, maybe dance as well, song and dance. I'm wondering whether in this context, by the way, just to round it out, I'm wondering whether, given this fact of these three stories, we shouldn't think about the story of the song of Devorah. At the very end of Devorah's song, we have the story of the mother of Sisera, the general of the enemy, the Canaanite general, who's been killed by a woman, but Sisera's mother's waiting for him to return. And there you have the women waiting for the victorious general to return. They can rejoice. But of course, over there, he's not returning. There we have Vatiyabei Veim Sisera. In contrast to the other women who are dancing and singing, she is mourning, she is crying. Vatiyabei Veim Sisera. Why isn't he back yet? That's the story of Sisera's mother in contrast to the other stories. So that's one point I wanted to make about Miriam. I would add, by the way, that we have two other stories in the Torah of somebody else who, after the victory, comes to affirm the victory. And that is both in the book of Breshit and the book of Shemot, later on in Sefer Shemot. We have two people who, after the victory, affirm the victory. In the first instance of chapter 14 of Breshit, of course, it's Malki Tzedek Mel Shalem, Hotzi Lechem Vayayin, who Kohen Liel Elyon. He's the priest. So you have the priest Malki Tzedek who affirms Avram's victory against the four kings, and then you have in our book in Sefer Shemot, later on we'll get to it in chapter 18, Vayavo Yitro Kohen Midyan. He comes afterwards and he affirms the victory that Israel, Moshe, and God, of course, that the defeat of the Egyptians, the freedom, the leaving of Mitzrayim, In each case, that's the role of the Melchizedek in the first instance, and in Yitro in the second instance, they are both priests. They are Kohanim, and the role of the Kohen is to bless. In each case, they offer a blessing. One of the roles of the priest is to bless. So we have very interesting two different responses. We have the blessing of the priest in two cases, and we have the singing and the dancing of the women. That's one point I wanted to make. Then let me just make the second point, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions. And my point I wanted to make about Miriam Hanuviyah is, and I'll make a third point too, but a brief one. But after the Song of the Sea, let me just make this one point. After the Song of the Sea, because it's verse 21, it's over. You have the word Yam 3 times, Vayosha Yam, Yam, and then Vatikach Miriam Hanuviyah. Shiru Hashem ki ga'oga, sus v'roch mavayam. Why did the Torah actually end here with Miriam? Not just Miriam, but with the women. Why did the Torah end that? This is the end of the Exodus narrative. The first part 1. It's part 1 is over. Then we're going to get to part 2. But why does the Torah end here with Vatikach Miriam Hanuviyah achot Aaron atov biyada? And I think the answer is actually a simple one. The end of the story recalls the beginning of the story. The fact of the matter is, this is one of the 2 stories in the Bible, which is really about women. Because Pharaoh says in chapter 1, kill the boys and keep the women alive. Keep them alive probably means to take them for yourselves. But he doesn't see in the women any kind of threat. Just kill the boys off, and then everything's going to be just fine. And the irony, of course, is that in the first 2 chapters of the Torah, and even beyond the 2 chapters, it's Dafka the women who are instrumental in bringing about the redemption. That is, you have the midwives in chapter 1, Shifra and Puah. You have this nameless child, Moses, in chapter 3, chapter 2, who has a sister and who has a mother. We discover the names later. Presumably it's Miriam and Yocheved, who conspire somehow to save this child from the waters. And you have Pharaoh's own daughter, actually, who's instrumental in saving Moshe. And later, when Moshe returns to Mitzrayim, he's saved by his wife Tzipporah. In other words, without the women, there's no redemption. Afin hayu b'yoto hanes, they women were involved in the miracle, and the Rashbam says, not just involved in the miracle, they were the ones who enabled the miracle to happen. So it's one of those stories where the women play the main role in terms of redemption. They make it all possible. So the Torah, I think, is saying over here, since the women are responsible, since the story begins with the women's interventions and the refusal to listen to the orders that are given to them, to not just follow orders. So it's most appropriate that when we finish part 1 of the story, that the women get the last word. We have Tikach Miriam Hanuviyah, achot Aaron et atov, v'teitzena kol hanashim achareh p'tupim v'imchalot. I would just add one more small point over here, and that is that the verse Vatan Lahem Miriam. This is chapter 15 again, verse number. Just to point out a problem. Verse number 21, last verse of this section. Vatan Lahem Miriam. Here they translate, Miriam chanted for them. Shiru Hashem ki ga'oga'a sus v'rochvo v'mavayam. What is the grammatical issue over here? The grammatical issue is in verse number 21, Vatan Lahem Miriam. Who is Lahem?
Yeah, it's masculine.
Lahem is a masculine form. You should have said Vatan Lahem. So now here's the point. I'm not an expert in biblical grammar, but I do know that the grammar of the Bible often doesn't follow necessarily in the strictest sense the rules that we were brought up with. Sometimes the Torah does use the masculine form for women. So it's not clear to me whether Vatanu Lahem means to the women, or whether Vatanu Lahem suggests that it's not just the women, that the women are sort of leading the dancing and singing and all that, but Vatanu Lahem refers to all of Israel, not just the women, but the men as well. So in any event, I don't know, but I think the point I wanted to emphasize is this is the last verse, and it's appropriate actually that the women do get the last verse, given the fact that without them there is no redemption altogether. Paro didn't think they're a threat at all, but the whole point of the stories is, it's a place where the men, for whatever reason, are not able to bring about the redemption. So the women have to step up and do it. The other story of the Bible where you have this, where the women are playing the role because the men either won't or can't, is of course the parallel story to our chapter, which is the story of Devorah. They're the story of Devorah, who is both a prophet and she's also a judge. She's the only actual judge in the book of Judges. She sits in judgment. She's on the Beis Din. And she's also a prophet. And she calls Barak, who's a general, and says, you fight against the Canaanites. And Barak says to her, if you go with me, I will go. And if you don't go with me, I won't go. And Devorah says to Barak, I'll go with you, but I want to tell you something. The great victory will come through the efforts of, not through your efforts, but through a woman. Ki biyad isha yimkor Hashem et Sisra. Sisra, the general, will be defeated by a woman. And that's a story, actually, where the women play the central role. There, because the men won't, for whatever reason, maybe they're just afraid, the men are refusing to take the role by themselves. Okay, if you, the general, are not going to do it, so then we women are going to have to do it. We shouldn't have to do it. That's not our role. But we can do it if we have to. So there are two stories of the Bible where the women play the role, where the men either won't or can't do what they're supposed to do. I don't want to get into it right now about the two stories because there are interesting parallels and interesting differences between them. I think that the two texts are different. I think that in one case, which is our case, in Shemot, everything the women do is totally appropriate. Given I would say, the stereotypical role of women, what they do in Sefer Shemot is completely appropriate. But in the book of in Shoftim, the women are forced to play a role they shouldn't have to play, but they can if they have to. They can also kill the enemy in their own devious ways. They shouldn't have to do that. But when the people who are supposed to do what they're supposed to do don't do it, then we all know that, unfortunately, other people have to step up and do things that they shouldn't really have to do. I speak to you here I'm in Israel now. I'm going back in a few days, been here for many weeks. And we certainly see this in Israel where people are doing all kinds of amazing things, serving in the army for months and months beyond where they should have to serve. 40 years old, 45 years old, 47 years old, 51 years old. Because a bunch of people refuse to do what they should do. Other people have to take the place. What choice? There's no choice. But it's a very sad situation when that takes place. And that's the story in Sefer Shoftim. Yeah, you don't want to fight, you're the general. That's what you do. Okay, someone else will do it in your place. Sure, shouldn't have to. But if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. So the Sefer Shemot is different, I think, because the men actually can't. Because they're enslaved. They can't do anything. And then the women are going to do what they do. I have more to say about it. Let me stop at this point and take comments or questions. I don't want to go over today because there's another lecture in 30 minutes, the Bohm Memorial Lecture. The topic is Kulanu Arevim Zeh Bozeh. We're all responsible for each other. I can't think of a topic that's more appropriate for the times in which we are living than this topic. Anyway, I'm going to stop a couple of minutes early to make sure everybody who wants to attend that lecture has time to prepare for the lecture, which I think is 11:45. But meanwhile, are there any comments or questions before we continue?
Yes,
yes.
I wanted to. I always wondered, after reading Shirat Hayam, it seems so asymmetrical. You have this lengthy exposition of the song of the sea, and then these few sentences always struck me as curtailed. But now I understand that we are beyond words. We are now in the world of inexpressible ecstasy. And I was thinking that the daily davening actually reflects this, is that it starts with the Pesika de Zimra, and it says it ends. This is, I can do no more. And then the next few words in the weekdays is Ishtabach Shimcho in an impersonal way, and not words, but Riach Kol Bosor. It's at that sublingual level that the prayer continues. And in the Shabbos service, it's Dishmas Kol Chai, the Warech Shimcho. It expresses the fact that our ordinary expressions are incapable of continuing this after what the Shirat Hayom had invoked.
Right. So I think that the issue that you're raising is one very dear to my own heart, I will say. And the place of song and prayer is something that I think is really interesting. Is a big topic. I would point out that, and have many thoughts about it. Something I think about a lot. It is very striking, actually, when you think about song, that the different sections of the daily service. The first section actually ends with Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid, which is a song. It's a shir, Mizmor Shir. And then you start Psukei Zimra with Baruch She'amar, and you end with Yishtabach Shimcha, Habocher B'Shirei Zimra, right? It's all about Shirei, Psukei Zimra, right? And then when you start the next section, the blessings on the Shema, and you end the blessings of the Shema with Micha Mocha, right? Shira Chadasha. You end with Shir once again. And then we have the custom that the very end of us, after we finish the davening, we have the song of the day, right? Today was right. We have the Shir Shel Yom.
Yes.
So every section of the davening in the morning, every single one of them ends with song. And I think the point is, as you have suggested, that words can't capture really our deepest feelings. We need something beyond words, and song is one of the ways that we are able to try to express something that we can't express through words. And that's the power of song. So I think that's something to think about in terms of prayer in general. What is the place of song and prayer, etc.? That's an important question, an interesting question, but it's not right now, but it's an important question. Anybody else for a comment or question or whatever?
I think we have time for one more.
Go ahead.
No, I'm just letting people know we have got time for one more. Any takers?
Are we to assume that she said the entire Shira?
I have absolutely no idea. I don't know. It repeats the first verse, basically. I don't really know. It's very hard to say. I would doubt that they're saying just one particular verse. Although, this raises another question about song in general, which is about repetition. Typically speaking, we think of repetition as a negative thing. But actually, when it comes to song, that's not the case. That actually sometimes you have a tune and you sing it once and twice and 3 times and 5 times and 8 times and 12 times and 20 times. And there's a power to that as well. So it's very hard to know. We have the custom in Hallel, when we say Hallel, that we get to the end of Hallel, we actually repeat every verse. We say every verse twice. So again, I don't know. Maybe they're just mentioning the first verse and she said all of this. It's unclear, but what is clear is that she's leading these women in song, perhaps in dance as well. Song and dance as a response to what has taken place. And yes, it goes beyond words. And it really does go beyond words. Come back to the first point, because this is an event which the song suggests is a cosmic event. It's not just about Mitzrayim. It's about the fulfillment of God's plan. God's plan was to create a world in which the human being serves God, and Israel is on the road to that. Israel is on the path. The path will be a lot rockier than we imagine, but at least we're out of Mitzrayim, and we'll be able to make our choices. Okay, I'm going to stop in 2 minutes, just because I want to make sure that we can get to the next lecture. Let me just read one verse to begin our own, which is verse number 22, which is Vayasa Moshe Yisrael miyam suf vayetzu al midbar shur. This begins our verse. We don't have to say too much about this verse. Moshe Vayasa, he caused Israel to journey from Yam Suf, and they go into the desert, Midbar Shur, and they walk 3 days in the desert, and they couldn't find water. This is how our story begins. The journey in the desert begins with no water. And we just had a whole chapter, a whole story, more than one chapter. Shirat Hayam, the waters of the deep, the great victory, the waters which bring about our victory. And now we're beginning to walk through the desert. This is part 2 of the book. And the first thing we're told is there's no water. If water in the first case is connected to revelation, God is present at the waters. People experience God. In the words of the Medrash, what the Shifcha Alayam, right? What the slave woman saw at the sea, the prophet Ezekiel, the great vision of Ezekiel, he didn't see what the bondswoman saw at the sea. So if the waters of the sea are connected to great revelation, what does it mean to walk 3 days in the desert when there's no water? Does it suggest to us that God seems to be quite absent as we begin the journey? So we'll have to pick up with this next week. Again, good to be back with all of you. And for those who wish to attend the next lecture, it's at, I think, 11:45. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.